Hi, welcome to the Jacobin Show. I'm Ariella Thornhill, and today we are joined by Adolph Reed, author of The South, Jim Crow and Its Afterlives. Hi, Adolph.
Hey, how you doing?
Good.
Yeah, that's great to see you live.
Yeah, this is kind of crazy, but I'm really glad that we get to talk about this book in person because,
Well, good, me too.
there's so much in the book. I wanted to start by talking about your strategy in grounding your analysis in anecdotes from your own life.
Ah, okay. Well, yeah, it's almost dishonest to call it a strategy, but it is strategic, right? I mean, like I've said a number of times, like I just started writing with no goal in mind, and not even really an audience. But the first version of the text, which was much shorter, combined sort of straightforward political and historical account with vignettes that basically took off from moments in my own experience that I thought would be helpful for shining light onto broader cultural, political, economic dynamics. So I did that, and I think that that's just kind of the way that my mind works about that sort of stuff anyway. And that's frankly one of the things that had drawn me and other people like the Ewens and others, some of Aronovitz to the Frankfurt School, is like the idea of sort of finding the logic of capitalism in cellular examination of facets of everyday life.
Yeah, I think it's really, really effective in the book because it takes some of the lack of specificity that the contemporary liberal view of Jim Crow has, right? Where it's like a lot of angry white people and bad feelings propping up this system, and it complicates it. And it complicates it in a way that seems very common sense to read it. When you read about these different kinds of community formations and networks, men getting together to work on a car, crossing the color line to do that, or listen to a baseball game together, you start to see that the sort of spectacular narrative that we have of that moment in time was actually a really complicated fabric of different individual calculations about how to conform to a system of segregation that was imposed on everyone, white and black alike.
Right, absolutely. And like that was the precise source of the book, right? And I mentioned this too, but I have a couple of good friends who around the end of the last century, like the three of us often enough round robin or all together, would remark on the fact that when our general age cohort was gone, there wouldn't be anybody else around anymore who had that kind of textured understanding, and therefore all there would be is this kind of stuff that you just described, and that not only doesn't make sense as a way to understand what the Jim Crow world was, and I mean, who wants to preserve a memory of the Jim Crow world anyway, right? But it's just a bad way to understand history, to understand how we got from there, wherever there was, to here, wherever here is. And I mean, a parallel, it's probably overstating it to call it frustration, but like every year around Martin Luther King's birthday, right? Wherever you're living, somebody from the local TV station is going to go to the middle school, grade school, high school, and ask kids what you know about Martin Luther King. And without regard to race, gender, age, whatever, like they all say some version of, a long time ago people didn't have any freedom, and then Martin Luther King came and brought them freedom. And when we think about how credentialed people think about the history of Black Americans or of Black people like in the US, it's like a narrative of oppression porn, right? That begins with slavery, which is just oppression porn. And then what follows slavery is what's often described as having been worse than slavery. So like sharecropping, Jim Crow, or more oppression porn, right? And that doesn't help you understand how we got to where we are, or well, there's no history like in that history. And another facet of it is that if what was bad about the past was the sadistic excesses, then that leaves open the possibility that slavery, minus the sadistic excesses, wouldn't have been so bad, right? And Triracialism, my son, once had a student a number of years ago in his African American history class, who was quite confused about why planters, didn't want either slaves or sharecroppers to be educated, because the black student, who was a business major, said, well, but it just seems like if he'd let them enhance their human capital, then they could have been more productive as workers, and it would have been better for him. So this is the world that we're living in now.
Yeah.
So anyway, I know I went what my grandmother used to describe as going all around Robin Hood's barn, right with that answer, but.
No, I think you make a really good point there, because that lack of specificity is something that you call out several times in the book, but you call it out on both sides. And I don't think people give you proper shrift for that. You're often portrayed as a kind of critic of the liberal or progressive left.
Right.
But you make it very clear that the fiction of what slavery was, the fiction of white supremacy, was a fiction for whites in the South. That them propping it up as this enduring system that, started with slavery and lasted and needs to be reclaimed. That fiction was unstable.
Right.
Jim Crow proved it was unstable.
Right.
And there's a similar kind of ideological falsehood operating with the liberal fiction about, the oppression porn version of racism in America.
Right.
So what do you think is the issue with the liberal side more clearly? The issue with the Republican side, we know, right? We don't want to prop up the idea that there was a kind of enduring white supremacy on the basis of black inferiority, and the South will rise again, etc.
Right.
But Afro-pessimism in its current iteration does something similar. It imagines a timelessness to racism.
Yeah, Afro-pessimism is like Madison Grant and Charles Murray dipped in chocolate, right? And that's all it is, right? It's the same argument, right?
Yeah.
That race drives the world and has always driven the world, even thousands of years before race was invented, right? Race was somehow driving the world. And one thought I have about this is that, this is first of all the ideology of people who always get enough to eat, because there's a kind of luxuriation in a romanticized fantasy of suffering, right? Right. We've always suffered, right? That people whose immediate material circumstances are not fully pacified just don't have occasion or interest in indulging, right? So that's one thing. Well, I tell you, so there's one little scene early in the book that I know has caught a number of people's attention. But when my little cousin from Jersey and I went to with my grandmother to the zoo,
So in that story in the book, just for our audience who hasn't heard it, you go to the zoo with your cousin and there's a pony ride.
Right.
I mean, every kid would want to ride a pony.
and at that point, we were in full, there's a picture someplace of the two of us together in my grandparents' driveway with me with the Roy Rogers suit with my pistol, and her with the Dale Evans suit with her pistol. So we were definitely in full flood. Wow, I get to ride a pony moment, right? Especially as two big city kids who don't see animals as a rule.
So you showed up, and then it was segregated. Only white kids could ride the pony.
Right. So until I was an adult, I thought of this as an illustration of what a bad person, the guy who wouldn't let us ride the ponies was. But then as I started to think about it, we really don't even have to think of him as somebody who was committed to Jim Crow. Right? He might have been. He might not have been. He might have been somebody who was committed to keeping his job.
Yeah.
Right. But And that gets us to what the liberals, or what the problem is with the way the liberals want to perceive this. Because for them, it's good people and bad people, people with good attitudes and people with bad attitudes. And what they have done consistently, right, about race or racial inequality is disconnected from political economy, right? So, and that's what their deal is.
And you said that at the time you felt offended, you know, and it is humiliating to be denied something.
Well, to be honest, I don't see. My cousin Gwen may have had like a more, sophisticated sense, but I doubt it. Like for me, at least, see, when things like that happened, I just cried because I couldn't get to ride the pony.
Yeah.
Right. And another story in that same part of the book with my grandmother is like the Algiers ferry. Right.
By the way, I love your grandmother.
She was a piece of work, I'm telling you. And she had a slogan like, "Love many and trust a few, but always paddle your own canoe."
You got to write these down. That's the next book.
Well,
so the story is you're on the Algiers ferry, which I've written actually with my kids now.
Right. Yeah, I'm sure you have.
Post Jim Crow, but there was a chicken wire fence.
Right.
And you and your grandmother and your cousin, is that right?
Oh, no, just me and my
grandmother.
Just
you and your grandmother had to sit behind the fence.
Yeah, somebody asked me a couple of days ago, or last interview or whatever, whether I was conscious that the people on the other side of the chicken wire were all white. And the fact is that I wasn't. Right? It just didn't register at that point. I was like 5 or 6. And again, like, I'm coming into and going out of the regime, basically. So part of learning the protocol is learning race difference, right? Also, and I mean, normally for people who are sort of born into it, it's kind of like being Catholic, right? You're just born into it, and you just sort of know that's who you are, and that's what it is. But it's not even a matter of some claim about not seeing race, whatever that means. But it's true. Like, Barbara Fields used to do this thing in her classes at Columbia, where she'd ask students how many people were sitting next to somebody of the same race. And then she'd ask them how many people are sitting next to somebody who looks just like you. And her point is that there are gazillions of ways that human beings vary phenotypically, right? But only some of them get picked up to mark something called the quasi-species difference of race. And her point was always to show that those markers were determined by political economic processes and dynamics, right? But it feels to me like we've lost so much ground, like on all those fronts. I mean, and I'll say this too. I mean, so I got into race as a research area. I mean, like race science, or race from the standpoint of history of ideologies, because around the turn of this century, Ward Connerly, who was like a douchebag, black douchebag from South Louisiana who moved to California and was just a nasty piece of work. He had first sponsored, I think it was an immigration restriction ballot initiative. And then he came back and did this thing, he called it the California Civil Rights Initiative, which would have prohibited the state from keeping records by race, right? But I was reading about it one day and learned that he had 2 exceptions for this prohibition. One was criminal justice, and the other was medical research. And I thought, well, you couldn't imagine being more ass backward, right? So I determined I was going to write an op-ed piece for one of the California papers. But before I did...
What year was this?
This must have been around 99 or 2000, 2001, something like that. But before I did, I thought, well, I'll go to the opposition group's website to see what position they're taking, because I don't want to get in the way. And I was stunned to find out that on the public health button page, whatever, the opposition was actually arguing that the CCRI would make it impossible to track diseases that only we get, right? We as people of color. So I thought, okay, well, shit, what can I do? Like, I can't write the op-ed piece now. They're also, as I understand it, wrong in the way that they're portraying what this bill would do. But even if they're right in a terrible way, right? Because they're opening the door for the return of racial medicine. And as you know, we've seen this again about COVID stuff.
Yep.
And why are people so oblivious to the impact of what they're actually doing?
So how did it feel to kind of look back at your life after coming to some of these conclusions about race and racial ideology later?
Well, that's an interesting question. And I'm not sure I have an answer, which may be weird. At one point in the 90s, when this little cluster of us, sort of, I don't know, left, black, essentialist, right, academics, was starting to congeal as a cabal, right?
You're verifying it's a cabal.
I'm outed, yeah. Ken Warren, who of course like is one of them, and we had like a 2-man seminar that we did for almost the whole time that I lived in Chicago at Jimmy's Woodlawn Tap in Hyde Park at the University of Chicago. And we're talking in the bar one night, and it just occurred to us both that most of the people in this circle of ours were either people who had been raised as military brats or academic brats. And it made sense because if you move around a lot, then you learn intuitively, right? That the idea of a racial essence is bullshit. Right? So, and then like for some of us, like you stir in that phenotypic mess down in South Louisiana, and that also kind of predisposes you to understand that this whole thing is fake in some way. So I don't know. I mean, insofar as there was a revelation for me that came along, or that came through the process of writing, it was that bizarre, new agey, incoherent sensation that I described in the intro. What was actually going on there, and it wasn't anything like Brigadoon. It was like a distinction between a way of seeing what were vestiges of earlier forms of interaction as being just that, and not as continuations of anything.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that throughout the book there are these anecdotes that seem kind of baldly as relics of Jim Crow. But the dominant narrative these days is like nothing has changed.
Right.
There's this enduring form.
Right.
What are the stakes for you in making it very, very clear what has changed and what has not changed?
Oh, okay. Well, first of all, like as a scholar, right, I'm just committed to getting the story straight, right? I mean, so that's one thing. And I just said to somebody a few days ago that whenever I hear the "nothing has changed" line, my impulse is that I wish I could I wish I had a Wayback Machine and could take the utterer and drop him or her in the Mississippi Delta in 1950 for about 6 weeks, then come back and pick them up. So that's part of it. And part of the problem is that assertion just betrays the extent to which people don't pay attention to the substance of the history, but get captured by the freeze frame photos. Right? I mean, speaking of Ava DuVernay's Selma. But the most important thing, right beyond my pedantry, basically, is that we can't get a handle on what current black politics is, or current race and politics, or the nexus of race and politics are, without understanding what undergirded that history, what was discrete about it, right? What forces, political, economic forces, brought it into existence, why, and therefore then where Jim Crow fits in an account of the evolution of American capitalism, right, over the last 300 years.
So where do you think it fits? Because there have been these attempts to kind of rework the story of the birth of America to be slavery. It's the original sin, the origin of every issue, past, present, future. Yes. To me, I saw parallels between that narrative and the Republican narrative of white supremacy, which also imagines an enduring white race that's existed forever. But aside from fighting it on that end, what are the particularities we need to pull out about how Jim Crow shaped the America that we're in today, and how we actually do combat racism and economic injustice? Okay.
Well, see, I'm not sure that our fight is with something called racism in the first place, right? I mean, I think, and that's another front on which I think we've lost badly over the last 50 years. Yeah, I mean,
will you elaborate on that?
Sure. Well, I mean, I've said this in like some places before, but a couple of years before I retired, I taught a grad seminar in Black American political thought, and it was really more of a bibliography course than it was anything else. The readings were massive, and students, led the discussions every week. And one week, a first-year student, and this was in, I think, fall semester, so it was like a first semester grad student who was a political theory type, was leading discussion around a massive readings between the mid-30s and the mid-40s. And it's like stuff from Ralph Bunche and Oliver C. Cox and a bunch of other people. And she began her comments by saying the thing that really surprised her was that nobody talked about the need to combat racism. Right? They were all fighting for concrete stuff and against concrete stuff. They were debating about specific visions of social organization. And they knew there was racism out there, right? But racism wasn't the enemy, it was institutions. And when you think about the struggle against racism, it's like first cousin to anti-terrorism, right? Because it's nothing concrete, like it doesn't live any place, right? There's no state that it's connected to. And the beauty of it is that you can never defeat it permanently. So like, if you're a racial justice warrior, then you basically got a job for life, right? And that's the thing I don't like about how we have come to talk about racism as the source of empirically observable inequalities. And this has been a problem for people who want to do that too. And that's why they've concocted modifiers, right? To support a claim that it's not, that there's something more to racism than an attitude or a disposition. So it's institutional, which has its own history and kind of a concrete programmatic history, but stuff like structural racism or systemic racism, and from the way that people talk about it that there's nothing there except the way that it makes them feel to say it.
Yeah.
Right.
Attaching systemic seems really legit.
Oh yeah. Right. Keeping it real. Right.
Yeah, but they couldn't define what systemic racism is.
No.
I think it's interesting in light of the content of your book, which is literally saying this is what segregation looked like on the ground.
Right.
And that in each instance of segregation, there were ambiguities. Can you give an example from the book where, you included it to illustrate that kind of concept?
Yeah, I think the neighborhood stuff kind of does that too, right? Fairly early, right? I mean, so like in, and like this, I like this one too, because it's another one that helps to show how stupid I was about some stuff for so long. So in older southern cities, and it's not just New Orleans, but it's like this in Charleston and a bunch of other places too. Residential segregation wasn't a thing until the 20th century, right?
Yeah. You have a line that neighborhoods were invented to kind of support a concept of the way that we ought to be living together and who we ought to be living with.
Correct, right, right, absolutely. And it's not quite the same, well, it kind of was the same in the North and the Midwest where suburbanization happened earlier. Like in Chicago, for instance, like the big flood to the suburbs came with improvement of streetcar technology, but also with the Haymarket riot, which just sort of drove the bourgeoisie up the lake because they were afraid the workers were going to kill them and drink their eyeball fluid. But when planned development came to the South, Baltimore on down, like it came at a historically specific moment when the urban planning was becoming a thing, when the idea of planned living, right, was what was beginning to get progress or appeal from capital or to capital P progressives, but also at the height or crest, at least, of anti-immigrant anxiety, and especially in the South after defeat of the populist insurgency, where upper status people felt like a cultural need on a daily basis to reassert their primacy in the social order, and to distance themselves from presumed social inferiors, right? And linthead is as much a racial category as coon, basically. So it's in this period that you begin to see these class and race homogeneous communities being planned, right? And it's not because, and I've learned that this is another distinction that a lot of people have some difficulty taking in. But it's because my argument isn't that people didn't think about racial hierarchy. No, it's that people didn't think about where you live as a domain for expressing your place within the racial hierarchy, right? And that took the emergence of the real estate industry and the idea of the neighborhood. Now, what made me feel especially stupid about this was that this didn't crystallize in my head until I started teaching Thomas Hanchett's book on Charlotte, North Carolina from 1900 to 1975. And Hanchett lays out how it happened in Charlotte. And then all of a sudden it hit me, like you can think about the dates of the neighborhoods, right? That had the reputation for being white, and it's like mainly after World War I. I mean, so people find themselves in these neighborhoods, and there's a natural disposition to be casually or convivial right at the quotidian level, right? Talking over the fence or whatever, and the way that, and I write about this, how people, whites from the neighborhood who were friendly, within the boundaries that everybody accepted, right? Who, when you encounter them someplace outside the neighborhood and experience a snub most often, and like this is and understanding that I grew into, like a kid wouldn't appreciate this anyway. And by kid I mean through teenage or through the high period of the civil rights movement, frankly. That like they were trying to navigate this thing too, right? And I mean, people tend not to think that the order was imposed on people. Right?
Yeah, they think it was born of their own feelings, and so it was natural, like a fish in water.
Right.
But actually, everybody, and your book shows this really acutely, everybody had to kind of negotiate against it constantly.
Right.
Like, you have the story of the white couple that owned a shop who kind of sat you down after you stole a bag of potato chips.
Right.
I hope you've stopped that, by the way.
Oh, yeah, I did. And look, all I could think about was Angola.
Yeah, I mean, there is something also important, I think, to unpack there, which is that in this reworking of American history around contemporary liberal narratives about race, there are other fictions that emerge around prison, incarceration,
Right.
segregation of neighborhoods, all of these things. For you, when you were in that moment as a kid, you did something every kid does, tried to steal a snack.
Right.
But the full weight of the realization that actually there was a system in which you did not have complete citizenship, would not be completely respected, and didn't have the rights of others. That hit you in that moment, stealing a bag of chips.
Oh, no, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know if I mentioned this in the book, but like I took the bus home from school, like in a lot of different routes. And on one of them, riding on the two-lane bus down to Tulane Avenue, you go right past the courthouse at Broad and Tulane, and the parish prison is right next to it. And emblazoned on the front of the courthouse is, "The impartial administration of justice is the foundation of liberty." And every time I rode past that, I just wanted to kill somebody.
Yeah.
Right? Because hypocrisy, God, right, my God. But and so the other thing about this sensibility that like whites just kind of, Jim Crow just kind of came out of the white psyche or whatever. Also, when I was a kid, my dad said this very often. I can't count the times I can remember him saying it. But the orthodoxy in the 50s in particular was that Jim Crow and lynching and stuff were the product of the backward, racist, white working class, which was empowered right after the populist movement. And my father would always say, often enough, with a bottle of a Miller High Life in his hand, "Gee, isn't it? But it's really weird, isn't it? I mean, didn't you think that if the white working class came to power, that they'd want to get something for themselves, or that they want to get something besides just being nasty to black people, right?" So I grew up with that understanding too. But
you talk about these anecdotes from when Jim Crow is kind of breaking down, and there's this place between the transition of one system to another where the ambiguity makes the tension seem more acute.
Right. Yeah.
Do you think that made a kind of, I don't know, do you think that made some parts of the white population in the South cling to or become more committed to the ideology of segregation as it started to fade away?
Well, yeah, in one sense it did, right? Because the fading away was over a couple of decades, and the intense violence against, civil rights workers,
Yeah.
right, is one illustration of that. The case of that old guy, like in Fayetteville, North Carolina, was
shoulder checked you.
right. Yeah, I'm not embarrassed about my reaction, right? I'm not proud of it, right? If he had continued and I'd beaten him down like in the alcove, I still wouldn't have been embarrassed by it, right? Because I felt then, and I feel now in retrospect, that if he missed it that much, then he must have been a guy who really deserved the ass kicking that he never got.
Imagine what he did when it was
Right.
fully sanctioned and expected.
Right. And frankly, it took me a long time to kind of get away from that attitude. Right? Frankly, it may have or it may have taken leaving the region, but and getting older. But so there's that, right? I mean, people clung to it, and at the same time, I mean, I recall my dad talking about this too. It's that the three racists whom the Archbishop excommunicated in 1962. My dad, who was an atheist, just kept saying, "Well, look, like the church has been telling," and the Gallo woman was the big villain. But he said, "Yeah, like the church has been telling her like all her life that segregation was God's law or whatever, and now they're telling her it's not." And I mean,
How's she supposed to
yeah,
react to that?
yeah, right. And then people would do stuff like, for instance, when you sat down next to somebody on the bus, even years after, often enough a white person would jump up, right? Mm-hmm. And what I always found kind of funny was like, because you really do need a program to figure out who's supposed to be what down there. Mm-hmm. A couple times I sat down with somebody I just assumed was safe because I'm not looking to draw. Look, I was a teenager. The last thing you want to do is draw attention to yourself in public,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
And somebody who I assumed to be close enough to black for it not to be an issue would pop up. Mm-hmm. So there were things like that, right?
Yeah.
That persisted.
Where the system leaves and it's structured interactions in a certain way, and then in the absence of it, people really don't know where they fall.
Right, that's right.
Yeah.
Right.
Can you talk about what was it called? Triracial.
Oh, see.
I think there are interesting tidbits about this in the book. On the one hand, you have this movement for economic sovereignty coming out of, certain black communities, and it's very clear that that's a reaction to Jim Crow.
Right.
And that a move to create a separate black economy,
right.
while short-sighted and ignorant of the fact that you couldn't sustain it without rights from the state,
right.
was still a kind of way of trying to subvert Jim Crow, but tacitly an assumption that Jim Crow was forever, right?
No, that's right.
And same, I think, with the kind of triracial, let's be declared.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, can you talk about that community and give us a description for the audience?
Yeah, well, yeah, sure. I mean, there was, as a general phenomenon or just a Halawa?
Yeah, talk about the Halawa because you focus on them in your book.
The one thing in the book that has led me to sweat being come after, right, is that there's a woman who writes for the Washington Post who is active as a Halawa Saponi. And I didn't know anything about the Saponi back in the day. And I'm assuming that this is just an alliance that got formed to kind of to legitimize everybody's race claim, basically. But my understanding of the Halawa, and this was, I learned about this not long after I got to North Carolina. In the section of the state, from Warrenton, a town called Ahoskie, which was ground zero, there's what phenotypically looks like or seems to be a big mixed race population, right? Big by, North Carolina standards or whatever. And the story about the Halawa is at some point in or after World War II, an element of this mixed race population decided that they weren't black or were tired of being black, and Lord knows anybody could be tired of that, right? And there's a Lumbee population there too. So they decided to create a Native American identity for themselves. And from what I understand from people with direct connections to it, I have a friend whose own family split over this. Her father and one or two of his brothers stopped speaking to each other. So
wow.
I know it's not an urban legend. So from what I understand, some of the early expressions of the Native American identity were, and this wouldn't be surprising either, but were naive stuff. So there was, in Oxford, for instance, there was a section of the town called the Stronghold after Cochise, right, from the TV show, right? So, but the thing is that they are inauthentic only if you believe in authenticity.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, and if you don't believe in authenticity, well, there's no problem, right? Yep. Right, I mean, you are what you say you are. Or as my son said, in his updating of Du Bois's thing about a black man being someone who must ride Jim Crow in Georgia, well, that you are what the police think you are. But anyway.
Oftentimes society is the judge of authenticity, not individuals. I do think there's a move to switch it where it's you decide your authenticity.
Oh yeah, I know.
And that's a whole other can of worms.
Yeah, but that's a whole other problem.
Nowadays, I do think there could be depending on who you are, critique of that community or reading into it. This kind of gets to the passing chapter, like you're not being your authentic identity. You must have animosity. Again, race is all about animosity. When in fact, you point to all of these kind of quotidian examples of people wanting beignets. So getting your grandma to go in because she could pass. And it wasn't an assault on the Black identity or a declaration of animosity. It was a simple matter of the calculus of Jim Crow.
No, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. It's like and I'm trying, I mean, it's like an accommodation that people make. Right. So and from that perspective, it's not that different from the Black doctor who buys a house in a neighborhood that's not necessarily a white one, but that's class insulated from working class Black people. Or from that perspective, it's not that different from having Jack and Jill to put your kids in to make sure that they have class homogeneity, And I mean, it was always kind of charged, but like I said, like my first encounter with the passing phenomenon was this woman who was kind of, intriguingly glamorous and sort of big in her gestures and bangles and stuff, as I recall. But I was a really little kid. But like, she didn't seem to think that she was hiding anything from her Black friends and family. Like, and okay, granted, this is like in that Creole world where everybody's got a cousin who crosses over somewhere, right? But the disjunction between how passing gets represented in American high culture, both the angst on the one side and the ambiguity and quadruple consciousness or whatever on the other, and the reality of it in a place where or in a setting where it's a comparatively common practice. It was just so striking. Like, I didn't originally intend to write about that. It's after, I think it's only after Faith Child started to push me a little bit that and I wrote about the triracial isolates, and it just seemed like that's from the triracial isolates to like the immigrants who get here, don't come, Frank Wilderson notwithstanding, don't come with a sense of anti-Blackness or a sense of race for that matter. Get here, you figure out you're on the margins of the political economy, and you figure out what the rules are. And the one thing you know is that, well, I may not be able to be white, but I sure got to figure out a way not to be Black. Right? And again, that makes sense, right? But it's not, somebody you want to give the Legion of Honor medal to, right?
Sure.
Right, but it makes sense for what people do.
And there's a disingenuous kind of way of remaking that about the sentiment of those people.
Right.
But actually, the sentiment wouldn't be possible if the rules of the game were different.
Right.
If the rules of the game had changed, then the sentiment would have changed too. I think your book does a really good job of making it clear how this story is being written from the contemporary perspective backwards, right? Where the contemporary perspective is being imposed on a lot of these people. And when you're saying, this is what I lived, this is what I saw, here's how ideology works, it actually makes it clear that the real engine of racism wasn't the day-to-day feelings that people had.
Right.
It was a system that required them to behave differently towards a set of second-class citizens.
Right, that's it. Yeah. And you put your finger on something else very important, which is the tendency to read the past from the standpoint of the present. Shortly after my father died, I was out in Fayetteville, Arkansas, where he lived, getting his affairs together. And at some point, I wanted to, go see a movie or something, and I had friends there who were still very good friends. And Cold Mountain had just come out. I didn't know anything about it. I knew that it had Nicole Kidman in it, which was one reason not to see it. But anyway, so before I saw it, I read a review, or I read an essay by Manola Dargis when she was still at the LA Times. And it was really smart. It was on that and some other period films. But what really struck me about it, what most struck me about it was her, what was the point she made that the only people who pay attention to historical accuracy now are the prop makers and the set designers, right? So like the restoration hardware, right, stuff is all like 1860. But the sensibilities, the dialogue, the moral compass is like pure contemporary neoliberalism.
Yep.
Right. And to me, like that's a point where art meets fascism. And I mean, I understand that there are much more mundane dynamics driving this, right? At the props of the star of the show, for instance. And that partly has to do with like international markets and whatnot. But that sensibility has also come to dominate how people who get paid, right, and sometimes handsomely with really nice working conditions compared to how the vast majority of Americans work today, to think about and write about the past, do it too.
Yeah.
Right? So back in the days when I developed my rep as the firebrand or whatever, that's the kind of stuff that I was reacting against. That, and so, I mean, like I said, I didn't want to talk too much about my autobiographical stuff, but I'll say this. Like after Ronald Reagan was elected the first time, and people got to see that he wasn't another version of Nixon, who talked it and did something else, that he was serious and they had like a revolutionary program. My reaction was, well, okay, I need to make common cause with liberal Democrats. So I tried to do that through most of the 80s, right? And then like the underclass stuff hit. Now, Ken Auletta had published a 5-part, I think, piece in the Atlantic, which has always been what it is, which became a book where he sort of lays out the underclass idea. But then the liberal academics pick it up, and it's pretty clear what this thing was. And then even people who understood themselves to be leftists, and socialists. I mean, I can't tell you how many people got in my ass for criticizing William Julius Wilson unfairly because he said structurals, right? So by the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s, like I was just so pissed off about that stuff that I would just call it out. And my defense was, when people would get my ass for calling it out, was, well, okay, but people who are pushing this line, which is really making up just so stories about what they reify from census tract level data as poor people's behavior, right? Who I get to beat up on and drag for the most vulnerable population in the society with impunity. And since those people can't get the microphone, then I figure one thing I can do is call out the game, right? But so, like, anyway, that experiment of trying to make common cause, like with liberals, it survived Sabra and Shatila just barely, just barely. It was one of those moments where I said, well, I'm sorry, but like we have problems here I got to deal with. And then later I went to the camps, actually, in the early 2000s. But, and it survived other stuff, right? But like the underclass, but what finally did it in was Clinton. And yeah, I was just thinking about this not that long ago, but within 4 or 5 months of Clinton's inauguration, I was on the phone with Paul Wellstone, who had been a friend of mine since college, and actually went to talk to him about the possibility of somebody running like a primary challenge against Clinton in '96. And that's when I got involved with the Labor Party at the same time.
To get back to the book, you end on a really positive note. I think you do have a reputation for being a firebrand, but I think people also misunderstand your work because for them, racial fiction is so taken for granted that they can't understand what your perspective is or what you're fighting for. They think it's, writ large dismissive of something that they believe in. But actually what you say is, you give all of these examples of the ways that people negotiated the segregationist order of Jim Crow. And then you said for most people it was unimaginable that in 15 years it would be gone.
Right.
So what do you take from that lesson? I think the book ends on a kind of optimistic note that we don't know the future, and it's set against this contemporary ideology that we know the future, present, and past because certain concepts are so enduring that they will shape our history forever.
Right.
So what do you think we should take from that, the lesson of Jim Crow's failure?
Well, yeah, I think there is something optimistic there, right? I mean, and even within or at the same moment that it would be tough to be, I wouldn't say pessimistic. Well, yeah, maybe I would. It would be tough to be more pessimistic about the realities of our current moment than I am.
Yep.
But both things are true at the same time. And see, so the optimism is ultimately like the open-endedness of history, right? Well, like when in 1986 World Series, when the Mets were down to their last out in the ninth inning, and they were going to lose to, God forbid, the Red Sox, which is like, that would be like, yep, I know from Maine, they are viewed.
I'm not a Red Sox fan.
Right, I mean, differently.
But I will be attacked roundly for saying that in this video.
Yeah. But the idea of like losing, and especially in Southern Connecticut, where the sports market was at that point kind of split between Boston and New York. So the prospect of losing to the Red Sox was just horrendous. And we're all sitting there watching the game, crestfallen. And the ball, and the routine ground ball goes through the legs of the Red Sox first baseman, and the Mets win, right? Once you put the ball in play, anything can happen, right? And there are greater and lesser probabilities, but that's not the way the probability works, right, in the world, right? So that's the upside. But see, the thing that's frightened me for most of my adult life, right, and like I think this kind of sparked something in my head when I read Voltaire's Parable of the Good Brahmin and Candide when I was like a teenager. But the idea that being oblivious can be helpful just frightens the hell out of me, because that just feels to me like concession to like the ultimate despair, right? So politically, I think I've got something a little more like a counterpuncher's reflex, right? That when you get hit, then the thing to do is to look around for a space that you can hit back at, or try to find a crevice like in the order that you can crawl into and start trying to pry it open. And to me, that's what the optimism is, because like I often, but I can't say have because I don't do it anymore, said to students who would want to, get into this kind of politics, I said, well, look, like it's not like NGO work, right? You got to think about it like a Major League Baseball player, that if you're successful 3 times out of 10, you go to the Hall of Fame, right? Because when you're trying to fight capitalism, you're going to lose a hell of a lot more than you're going to win. And so.
And I think if you said, to a group of people, a group of liberals who are very invested in the idea that there's a kind of enduring racism, if you said there's an enduring racism that's been in America since its conception and potentially in the world, they'd be like, yes, absolutely. But if you said the civil rights movement abjectly failed and every black radical and ally of the cause also failed, nothing has changed, they would be like, how can you say that?
Right.
And it's funny because you get a lot of hate, but you're saying, look at our victories. Look at them starkly. Look at them
Right.
realistically.
Right.
Look at the real political systems we are within. Look at the way we've changed them. I mean, what you've traced is the path of your life as it was affected by Black people gaining full citizenship in the country, however imperfect
Yeah, right.
it is expressed.
Right.
And I think that, that feat shouldn't be underestimated.
No, I agree. I mean, and it's kind of a weird, almost like a schismogenesis, right? In the sense that there are two contradictory seeming balls you need to hold in the air, or one needs to hold in the air at the same time. That's one of them for sure, right? I mean, and but I think I mentioned this in the book too. Like when I'm out someplace now and see like an interracial group of people out, just doing something, right in a bowling league or having lunch at TGI Fridays or whatever, that I recall that this is something that could not have happened as late as 1960. And there are sequelae, right, that follow from having that kind of interaction, work in the same office together. And that doesn't mean that it's Brotherhood Week or that you're standing on the hill teaching everybody to sing in perfect harmony together, right? But there's something there that can enable concerted behavior, right? That the whole point of Jim Crow was to preempt. And I'll tell you, like I don't say this in the book, but when we started working in South Carolina in this ballot project in 2006, we spent a lot of time working at flea markets, which are like poor people's shopping centers, malls, basically. And it was striking that how many current and former interracial unions, down through the working class, right, from stable working class down to the bottom, basically, we encountered. And like what with the white grandmother who looks like she just stepped out of the uprising of '34 with her little black grandbaby, and the daughter's got some other dude that she's with, and yeah, I had a student at Penn in 2016, semester of the election, who we were talking one day, and she's from the Mississippi Gulf Coast, and I just assumed she was like a middle class, or the child of middle class black professionals, right? And down there, it turns out she's what is nowadays called a biracial, and she was raised by her white mother's family. Father wasn't much in the picture. What with the mother's family is at the busted end of the working class, and she said that while they were driving her crazy around the Trump stuff, because they all loved Trump, and what I guess, for the sake of keeping myself out of trouble now, I should call the N-word, peppered people's discourse, that at the same time in her life, she had never felt anything except loved and protected and cherished by this family of hers. So as you know, this shit's complicated, right? So why don't people want to accept the complicatedness of it? I think liberals don't, by and large, because they're invested deeply in seeing themselves as morally superior to their friends, neighbors, family members, coworkers, right? Because when you get down to it, upper status liberals are the people who, apart from the really, really rich, live the most segregated, class skewed lives in this country, right? Their schools, their workplaces, right, their neighborhoods. So for them, it's almost like there's almost like a psychological need for the West Wing crowd to have Archie Bunker out there, to project all of their own, or the emotional expressions of their own material practices onto him, right? So that's one reason. For the POCs, the complicatedness is unacceptable because what has become over the last half century, right, understood as black politics, or for that matter, Hispanic or Latino politics or Asian American politics, is very much a class politics. And a class politics that's crafted within the framework of ethnic pluralism, right, like in the US.
And a natural, authentic constituency that is pre-existing and not constructed.
Exactly, right. I mean, that's exactly right.
Oh, what you said reminded me of a controversy at Little Red Schoolhouse, which is around the corner from here, where they had black students that were mostly there on scholarships, and the kids were feeling weird being in there with like a bunch of other white kids. So they put them all in the same homeroom group.
Right, yeah.
And people were like, my kid doesn't have a black in their class now. Like, we paid good money for them to go here and learn to be tolerant. And the black kid isn't even with them. And they literally, like, they started writing letters. I think a couple celebrities wrote letters being like, give my kid a black kid to make them tolerant.
Oh my God. Oh my God.
Yeah, I got to find you that
This should be a
article.
South Park episode.
Yeah, some of it's like, satire doesn't exist anymore.
No, it doesn't.
The last question.
Right, very good.
So you write, the tendency to mistake superficial familiar imagery for actual continuity threatens to obscure how the present differs most meaningly from the past. And you similarly criticize people today using allegory to relate modern politics to the past. What should we take from the past and what should we leave behind?
Okay. Well, yeah, I'm not much into taking stuff from the past. Here's the way I approach it, right? That I think the relation between past and present is what I've described like elsewhere as a generative one, right? So that to make sense of the present can call for kind of a deep dive into tensions, conflicts, and contending perspectives in the past, and how they get resolved through contestation, and the terms on which they get resolved become like the terms of a present that close off some ways of thinking, some options, and open up others in a way that can't be predicted, right? But can only be worked out concretely, right, through struggle and contestation. And then that new present then becomes the sort of baseline for how people approach thinking, or how people approach interpreting the forces that are unfolding around them as they see them, right? And in that sense, I think the relation between the past and the present or figuring out the relation between the past and the present may have to, or has to do ultimately with examining or close examination of the eddies of tension and conflict and perspective that operated in the past, get resolved and then the process happens again. Yeah, it's something almost like coming to understand the present a little more clearly by getting a clearer picture of what its ancestral forms were.
So you're resisting allegory with anecdote. That's the book summary right there.
Totally. Totally.
Well, Adolph, thank you so much for joining us. The book is The South, Jim Crow and Its Afterlives, out from Verso Books. You can buy it directly from the publisher if you don't like Amazon.
Very good.
Thanks again for coming over. This was a great opportunity to dive into the material of the book.
Well, hey, thanks much for having me. And I've had a lot of fun. Thanks again, guys.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.